Hello, this is Malcolm Bowden. I'd like to talk to you on the subject of the Earth being in the centre of the universe. But before I do so, I'd like to make two introductory comments that will have a bearing on what I say later. The first is, what would you think of a university that refused to teach 3 important experiments to its students in astronomy or physics or anything to do with those technical subjects? Further, what would you think of the whole university, all the universities around the world who also refused to teach any of their students these 3 very important subjects, simply because they would drastically change our understanding of what this universe is alike, how it is built and how it is working? That's the first point I'd like to make. These 3 experiments have been hidden from their students for 130 years. The second thing I'd like to introduce to you is a scenario. I want you to imagine that you're in a small boat in the middle of a huge lake. You can see all the mountains and the trees around the perimeter, but it's a long way away. But not far away from you is a huge liner, and you're in a small boat. And you notice that this liner, compared with the background, is going round you regularly, and you can see how frequently it is going round you. Now you know the distance to this huge liner, therefore you can work out what speed it is going round you. Let's say it was 30 miles an hour. Now you are looking at this liner and it suddenly dawns on you that perhaps it's not the liner going round you, it is perhaps you are going round the liner. And you cannot tell which way round the motion is going, whether it's the liner going round you or you going round the liner. But there is one very simple thing that you can do, and that is, all you have to do is to put your hand in the water. If you feel the water rushing past you, and you can see that it is about 30 miles an hour, then it's pretty certain that the liner is stationary and you are going round the liner. But what happens if you put your hand in the water and find that you are stationary, you are not going through the water? This would surely indicate that it is the liner that is going round you. Now that's a little scenario I'd like you to remember when we are developing this subject a little further. There were 4 very important experiments carried out in connection with our movement in the sun and the stars. One of them is very well known. The other, as I say, have been carefully hidden away. The one that is really well known is the Michelson-Morley experiment. Michelson and Morley set up an experiment with 2 long tubes at right angles to each other, and they passed light backwards and forwards in these 2 tubes, one at right angles to their direction and one in the line of the direction of their movement around the sun. They carried out this experiment over many months, making hundreds of recordings, and to their astonishment they found that they were not going round the sun at all. We were in fact pretty well stationary, it seemed. We were expecting to measure a speed of about 30 kilometers per second, and the highest measurements they got were around about 10 kilometers per second, down to something like 1 or 2 kilometers per second. Nothing like the 30 kilometers per second that they were expecting. This threw the whole of the scientific community into complete chaos. They simply did not know how to handle this particular factor, that we seemed not to be going round the sun. So they very quickly rushed out, you might call it, and invented what is known as the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. And they claimed that perhaps one of these long tubes was shortened when it was going at right angles to the direction of motion, and that compensated him for the shortening of the readings that they were getting that these readings were not as big as they should have been because there was some problem with the equipment they were using. It was a complete invention. A few years later, Einstein produced his theory of relativity, and where we could measure the speed of the Earth going through the atmosphere, through the ether, then he just simply got rid of the problem by abolishing the ether. Now that is the only one of the 4 experiments that indicate that we are not going round the sun, but the sun, the moon and the stars are in fact rotating round us. Let me look at the other 3 experiments. Now, a few years before the Michelson-Morley experiment, in 1871, Airy, who was the Astronomer Royal, carried out an experiment to see whether we were moving through the ether and the starlight coming down the telescopes was stationary and it was we who were doing the moving, or whether perhaps we were on a stationary Earth and it was the starlight passing across us that was producing what is known as Bradley's experiment, in which if you have a vertical tube of telescope pointing directly upward to a star, then the light, and the star was stationary, then the light would come straight down through the centre of the telescope and be registered in the eyepiece. Now, supposing you started moving the telescope at, let's say, 5 miles an hour, and therefore, in order for that light to be still registered in the centre of the telescope, you would have to tilt your telescope in order to allow for your movement as the starlight is travelling down through the telescope. And let's say that at 5 miles an hour you had to tip your telescope forward about 5 degrees. Now let's consider the possibility that it's not the telescope that's doing the moving on the Earth, but it is the starlight coming in at an angle, because it is the starlight that is moving with the ether as the ether goes past the telescope. Again, you would have to, if it was the same speed, you would have to tip the telescope by about 5 degrees in order to register that starlight in the centre of the telescope. However, you can't tell when the telescope is tilted at 5 degrees whether it is the telescope moving or whether it is the starlight moving. But there is one very simple change that you can make that checks out whether the telescope is moving or the star, and what you have to do is just simply fill the telescope with water. That slows down the starlight through the telescope very much more. Now, if it is the Earth that is moving, you would then have to tip the telescope from, let's say, 5 degrees and increase it more to 10 degrees, because it's now travelling slower as it moves down the telescope, and you would have to tip the telescope a little further. But if the starlight is already coming in at 5 degrees and it is simply slowed down, you don't have to tip the telescope any further, and therefore you can find out whether the telescope is moving or the starlight. And Airy filled the telescope with water and compared it with previous measurements of the same star, and he did not have to tip that telescope any further than in the previous set of readings when the telescope was without water. And that showed very clearly that it was not the telescope that was moving, but the starlight and the ether was moving relative to a stationary telescope. Now, because he didn't get the results that was expected, it was called Airy's failure. And the interesting thing is that if you read his report, it is very short, and there is not a single mention of the significance of that experiment. It is purely talking about the various accuracies of the experiment that he made. Nothing about the amazing conclusion that comes from Airy's failure, i.e., that it is the telescope that is stationary and the starlight coming in is coming in at an angle, which doesn't change when you fill the telescope with water. The second experiment I want to talk about was carried out by Michelson and Gale in 1925. They set up 4 tubes in a big rectangle in a field in Chicago and tested as to whether the Earth is rotating at the so-called 24 hours a day. To everybody's surprise, and again it's one of those experiments that is not often referred to, hardly ever, they found that they could record that the ether was moving across the face of the Earth within 2% of the calculated figure of 24 hours per day. Therefore, either the ether is going past the Earth and the Earth is stationary, or the ether is stationary and we are turning inside the ether. That is the surprising result, that they measured it within 2% of the expected value. Now, in 1905, Einstein produced his theory of relativity, which got rid of this problem of the ether, and he just simply abolished it. The problem was it made so many difficulties for the physicists and the astronomers that in the abolishing of the ether, he made himself a very complicated and really quite self-contradictory theory of relativity. However, in 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment in a laboratory. He had a turntable and he passed a beam of light clockwise round one way and another beam of light anti-clockwise round the other way, and then compared them when they came back to the measuring centre. And as he turned this table at only 2 revs per second, he found that he could measure the fact of the light travelling in different directions, recorded different fringes, that is the way they measure them, on his experiment, easily showing that frankly there was an ether and that the light had to go with it or against it as it travelled round the turntable. And this ultimately really completely demolished the theory of relativity, which had already abolished the ether. From Sagnac's experiment and many others carried out like it since, the ether clearly does exist, and it is a framework against which we can see whether we are moving against that framework of the ether or not. And therefore the result that Michelson and Morley got, that we were not travelling round the sun at 30 kilometres per second, is absolutely valid. We are not travelling around the sun. Now remember that those 3 experiments that I have spoken about are never ever taught in universities anywhere around the world.